Welcome to the Cities of Migration Learning Exchange. Today's session brings you perspectives on Canada's immigrant future, a new project at Cities of Migration that explores the challenges and opportunities of immigration to some of our smaller cities and towns and regions. The Immigrant Futures webinar series is presented in partnership with Higher Immigrants Magnet, Hamilton Economic Development, the City of Moncton, the Halifax Partnership, and the Leeds-Grenville Local Immigration Partnership, with funding support from Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. Today's webinar is about making the case for our immigrant future, regional perspectives on small and rural regional challenges. Until a decade ago, labour market growth in Canada's smaller cities, towns and regions depended on turnover and growth in the local population. Today, many of those communities are experiencing structural decline and need a substantial boost in population growth to ensure both that local businesses and industries have the workers they need and local governments have the tax base required to sustain community resilience and well-being. With economists reporting that all labour market growth in Canada today is fueled by immigration, our regional prosperity increasingly depends on attracting immigrants outside the big cities. Today's webinar offers one such regional perspective on those challenges and invites us to think about what it will take to attract and retain newcomers to our regions. In Fredericton, we have Alex Leblanc of the New Brunswick Multicultural Council to share findings from a 15-city province-wide consultation conducted last year in New Brunswick. And then in Toronto, we'll be joined by our guest moderator, Jasmine Gill of the Century Initiative, for more insights on why Canada's immigrant future is about all of us. So first, let's go to Fredericton. I'm delighted to welcome our co-host and today's guest speaker, Alex Leblanc, Executive Director, New Brunswick Multicultural Council. In addition to his leadership at the New Brunswick Multicultural Council, Alex co-leads a social innovation lab with New Lab, the Government of New Brunswick, and the New Brunswick Business Council, which works to develop and test innovations that can help New Brunswick become a leader in attracting immigrant participation in the provincial economy. Alex also co-chairs the Provincial Long-Term Integration Committee, which is tasked with reviewing government programs, policies, and initiatives with a newcomer lens. Welcome, Alex. The podium is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. Can you hear me fine?
Beautifully.
All right, yeah. Perfect. Great. Well, to start off, I'd like to extend a big thank you to Kim and the Cities of Migration team for an invitation to speak with you today. Also, a big thanks to Jasmine Gill, who's joined us and going to moderate our discussion after the presentation. And of course, to the audience, to the broad, sweeping audience that's tuning in from across Canada, and I understand from some other countries as well. So as Kim mentioned, I'm going to talk about an initiative that we developed in New Brunswick to spark conversation with rural and remote communities, as well as our urban centers, about the future of our demographics, about labor shortages, and about how immigration can play a role in creating a more vibrant future. So with that, maybe I'll start with a quick introduction of who, New Brunswick who, or where exactly am I speaking of. So New Brunswick is a maritime province, a member of the Atlantic region. We're a smaller province on the east coast of Canada. That's us in red there on the map. So if you haven't heard of us, I won't be surprised or disappointed. We're not as prominent as Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, but we play an important role in the Canadian Federation. A few things that we're known for, excuse me, in New Brunswick. We happen to be the only officially bilingual province in Canada. So many people are familiar with Canada being an officially bilingual country. And what that means is essentially all of the services and the jurisdiction of the federal government needs to ensure bilingualism in the services they provide. But in terms of the provincial level, which tends to provide services such as education, healthcare, public safety, social services, those are a provincial jurisdiction, and in New Brunswick, we've adopted an official bilingualism policy, and that means that all services provided from the provincial and federal government in New Brunswick, and really in most local communities as well, are offered bilingually in French and English. People may be surprised to know that in New Brunswick, we actually are home to the first incorporated city in Canada. So the history of our province goes far back, and St. John, New Brunswick was incorporated in 1785. I believe that this was among the first incorporated cities in North America as well, but certainly the oldest city in Canada. And that's a port city, so might explain why it was among the first. We're also known in New Brunswick for the highest tides in the world. The Bay of Fundy, which is kind of along the southeastern coast of New Brunswick. You'll see in the photograph here that the tides are known as the largest in the world. So 160 billion tons of water flow in and out of the Bay of Fundy every day, twice a day, which is more actually than the combined flow of the world's freshwater rivers. So it's a big attraction, a tourism attraction for our province. It's beautiful, and another thing we're known for here. To tell you a little bit about our economy in New Brunswick, on the top left, you'll see a photograph of the Irving Oil Refinery. We're home to the largest oil refinery in Canada. Our exports also include forest products. It's a big export for our province. Seafood and aquaculture are very big industries in New Brunswick. And we're the second largest exporter of wild blueberries in the world as well. So these just gives you a portrait of kind of our current economy, very much historically a resource economy. And I just want to give this as context so that people have an idea of where we're talking about and kind of what immigration might look like in this context. Now, we're also known for some other things in New Brunswick. A bit of a dubious honor that we received in 2016 following a census, which is a comprehensive data collection on our demographics in Canada. New Brunswick was recognized as the only province in Canada to have a population decline between 2011 and 2016. So among all of the things that we're known for in Canada, we're known as an aging and declining population, which is spelling challenges for our economy. That city, St. John, that I referred to earlier, the first incorporated city in Canada, also happened to be the only census metropolitan area or city in Canada to decline in population as well. You'll see this is a chart with all of the kind of larger city centers across Canada and their population growth between 2011 and 2016. And you'll see St. John at the very end, which saw a 2.2% decrease in overall population in that period. So, our first incorporated city, an important part of our history as a country, is now starting to run into the demographic challenges that all Western societies are running into right now. And so, in many ways, we were kind of the first to confront these challenges head on. I also want to mention or highlight that in terms of Canada's experience with immigration versus New Brunswick, across Canada, 21.9% of residents in the country were born elsewhere. So they were born outside of our country. In New Brunswick, only 4.6% of our population were born abroad. So this gives you a sense of how diverse, multicultural our population is in New Brunswick compared to the rest of the country. We simply have less experience and less prevalence of immigration historically. And yet, there's a well-known kind of polling company in our region called Corporate Research Associates, and they did a survey of residents in our province to ask them, are we more equally or less diverse as compared to other parts of Canada? And he found 48% of New Brunswickers, or the Corporate Research Associates, forgive me, found that 48% of New Brunswickers believe we are more or equally diverse compared to the rest of the country. And he joked, Don Mills, that apparently they never left home. But, you know, building off of my previous slide, which highlights how much less immigration we've seen in our province, that essentially 1 in 20 residents were born outside of the country compared to 1 in 5 across Canada, New Brunswickers themselves still believe or see themselves as being more equally diverse. So there's a gap in terms of the reality and the perception, which caused some concern for us. So I'm going to highlight a few demographic kind of and immigration key facts for context. New Brunswick is tied for the oldest population in Canada. Our median age in New Brunswick is 45.9 years of age, compared with 40.8 across Canada. So we are, I guess, in terms of median age, the oldest province in the Federation. We're also relatively small. Our entire provincial population is 750,000 people. So we're geographically dispersed. 48% of residents live in kind of what we would categorize as a rural context. And there's no CMA or city area that is larger than 150,000 people. So we have some urban centers, but the largest region kind of or census metropolitan area would be below 150,000 people, which I'm, again, sharing for context because it might resonate with people across the country or elsewhere that are interested in this topic and trying to figure out how to engage rural and smaller communities in kind of regionalizing immigration. And I guess that the last big kind of stat that we talk about a lot in our province is that over the next 10 years, we're anticipating 120,000 permanent exits from our workforce due to largely the baby boomers exiting the labor market. And in that same period, our public school system is only expected to graduate 76,000 students. So this just kind of highlights the contrast in terms of kind of the impact that it's going to have in terms of the baby boomers leaving the workforce and kind of what that next generation of Canadian-born and New Brunswick-born residents will look like in terms of replacement. And so in 2017, at the end of 2017, we did some polling in New Brunswick to see, what New Brunswickers felt about immigration. Did they believe that our province is best served by having more immigrants, the same number of immigrants, fewer immigrants, or other? And what we learned from that poll, and there's lots of ways to interpret polling and data like this, but what we took away was essentially 2/3 of our province believed that we should have the same numbers of immigrants coming to New Brunswick or fewer, which is at odds with the demographic challenges and the labor market imperative, which I think is I don't want to preach to the choir. I think everybody on this call will appreciate that. So we had to come up with some ways of engaging the province and kind of raising awareness about exactly what this labor market reality was going to look like for our province and the role that immigration would play in and should play in addressing that. And what we came up with, we engaged our provincial government, federal government partners. We also engaged some key stakeholders in the private sector, as well as community partners. And we recognized we needed to do some community engagement and raise awareness about, I guess, the imperative for immigration. And we came up with a campaign or an initiative called New Conversations, essentially wanting to have new conversations about our communities, about our labor market, about our economy, and really tease in this immigration component so that people start associating economic prosperity and community vibrancy with immigration. So this is a quick map of the communities we visited, and I want to highlight, I mean, the names of these communities may not mean anything to you, or will likely not mean anything to you, but what it illustrates is that we truly touched all parts of our province. These communities range in size from 2,000 to 3,000 people to 80,000 people, and so we wanted to, even as a small province, as a relatively rural province, we didn't want to limit the conversation to our urban centers because the labor market challenges, the population and demographic challenges were also occurring in smaller communities, as small as 2,000 to 3,000 people, and they could also participate in a project around increasing immigration, and integrating and welcoming newcomers, and becoming a more diverse and multicultural community. So we visited 15 different communities throughout the initiative, and our objectives throughout the tour were to raise awareness about the demographic and labor market realities in each region of the province, and so we did actually prepare unique information for each of the 15 communities in the tour. It wasn't just high level, this is what New Brunswick is facing, but we went down to the county level, even the municipal level where possible, to give them a portrait of their industries, their labor market, their demographics, to illustrate for them as well, like what is the median age in a kind of a smaller coastal town in northern New Brunswick versus the median age in the whole province. So as I said earlier, the median age is essentially 46 for New Brunswick, but in some of these communities it was 50, 51, 52 was the median age. So it just shows them that even as in the oldest province in the country, your community and your region is significantly older than the median age of the province. So it kind of illustrated for them the challenge that they face. We also wanted to engage employers in the option of using immigration to address immediate and future labor shortages. So many employers were experiencing labor challenges, but they hadn't necessarily considered or investigated how immigration could play a role in helping their business moving forward. So we did have specific conversations about employers. And ultimately, and perhaps most importantly, the conversation was a holistic community conversation, and we had in every event a significant engagement from the municipalities and the kind of the regional communities, and we also had chambers of commerce, the local chambers. Just getting a bit of an echo there. If you don't mind muting your phone. We had local chambers of commerce involved, so it was very much a community conversation in the end. The tour approach, how do we tackle this? Well, for each of the 15 communities, we recognized that we needed that local buy-in and that local leadership, so each community had a local, what we called the local planning committee, which included the municipality, Chamber of Commerce, the local multicultural and settlement agency, and any other significant stakeholder in that community. It varied from one to the other, but we tried to adapt and really find those organizations with convening credibility, that if they sent an invitation or if they were there and a part of it, their community would respect and trust the initiative. We also engaged two well-known and respected economists in our province to actually prepare these labor market profiles for each community and then to present them at these events. So they came on the road with us to kind of give that objective economic perspective in terms of talking about the labor market and how those challenges, if unaddressed, could cause significant economic strain on our province. Each event featured the voices of local employers who were involved in immigration, but maybe who had not been vocal or visible on the issue to date. So people that these include nursing homes, forest corporations in the forest industry, really you name it, the restaurants. We tried to pick a diversity of employers, but we gave them a platform to tell their story about why it is that they're turning to immigration and the contributions that new Canadians are making to their business. And we also featured the perspective of newcomers to tell their story, because there's a lot of nuance and I think a lot of ignorance about kind of what an immigrant goes through in coming to a new community. And so we wanted to lift up their voices and help educate people about that experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will. We framed the challenge of our demographics and labor market, but really asked communities to themselves identify what the solution would look like in their area. So we didn't come prescribing a solution. We had a lot of people early on ask us, well, are you going to come in and bring kind of a cheat sheet or kind of a playbook, if you will, for how to do this correctly? In our experience and our strategy going into it was to bring them a problem, get them motivated and engaged in it, and empower them to run with solutions. And that actually in the end proved very successful, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And lastly, we tried very hard to keep politics out of these conversations. Immigration is a very politicized issue, but what I mean by that is we tried to keep the federal politics and even provincial politics, which tend to be historically more engaged or involved in the immigration discussion. We tried to keep those politicians and parties and agendas out of the conversation and keep it focused on kind of an objective discussion about what we want our communities to look like moving forward, because we were heading into a provincial election, and it could have been seen as a space to kind of campaign or platform on the issue, and we didn't want to see or further encourage that politicization of the issue. This is a quick portrait of the partners we engaged for the initiative. There are over 100 partner organizations that we involved very early on and kept involved throughout the process. Many of these organizations were involved in a local committee, but also guiding the project at a higher level. And I think having partner organizations formally endorse the initiative, put their logo on it, and participate gave the conversations more credibility. When you have a Chamber of Commerce talking about this is important, it's more believable than if you have an organization like ours that essentially plays an advocacy role around immigration. So naturally we would be supportive of this, but when you have maybe non-traditional voices coming to the table, like municipalities, like chambers of commerce, like industry associations, it becomes more believable, and people trust it. So at the tours, or at each of these events, we essentially started by saying, look, our province for decades was, our labor market was fueled by a steady flow of new workers. And this chart shows from 1978 through to 2017 growth, pretty consistent growth right up until about 2008 from more workers joining the workforce. And this is in part because of baby boomers. Obviously, there was a significant growth in population, and when they joined the workforce, that accounts for much of the growth. But we also know a lot of growth came from more women joining the workforce. And so just as a rule, our economy benefited from more workers participating, more economic activity, more consumption, more taxes being generated, and that created conditions for good economic growth in our province. In 2008, we see more or less a flatlining of the labor market growth in New Brunswick, and that's because of largely baby boomers beginning to exit the workforce. And so with fewer people coming into the labor market, it highlights that, where does that graph go into 2020, 2030, 2040? Are we going to continue to see labor market growth, and what would that mean for our economy? We had conversations about what's at stake if our current labor force trends continue. Based on the trends, we highlighted that New Brunswick could lose 40,000 plus workers in the next 10 years. Well, in a province of 750,000 people, with a workforce of about 350,000 people, 40,000 workers is a big loss and represents billions in economic activity and hundreds of millions in lost tax revenue. So what are the consequences if we don't address this? We also talked about in each community the average age of entrepreneurs. In our province, over 40% of New Brunswick entrepreneurs are 55 years or older. So where does that relief come from? Where does that succession take place? So that and where's the next generation of entrepreneurs to kind of drive our economy moving forward? When people hear this, it starts to spark very important conversations that need to take place. We also underlined that our healthcare spending is going to continue to rise dramatically as our population ages. So today, or last year, there were 65,000 people in our province over the age of 75. And in 15 years, it's expected that number will double. Well, the cost per person for healthcare when they're over 75 is 4 to 5 times higher than the average cost per person for healthcare. So it's not even necessarily just the loss of revenues and the loss of economic activity. We're also going to see growth in our expenditures. And finally, it was a question of, do we want as a province to manage the challenges of growth, or do we want to manage the challenges of decline? There will be challenges. They're inevitable in governing, and there will be challenges in our future. The question is, the challenges of growth include things like, how do we integrate people from different cultural backgrounds into our workforce? How do we educate in increasingly diverse, culturally diverse schools? Things like, how do we recognize foreign credentials, and all of those kind of sets of challenges that come with immigration. But the alternate challenges are, which schools are we going to close because the student bodies the student numbers are dropping, or which roads will we not pave, or which taxes will we increase in order to compensate for lost tax revenues. And so we tried to frame it as a kind of a crossroad for our province between the challenges of growth or challenges of decline. So I'm going to quickly highlight some of the results, and I guess we'll get into some conversation. We had in the end over 1,300 people participate across the 15 town hall conversations. We saw a significant increase in local and provincial media stories framing immigration as a labor market solution. So at all of these events, we had media engaged. They did local media, more provincial media. We had op-eds and all kinds of things coordinated as part of the initiative. And what we saw is media kind of heard it, and it actually served as an education for our media who are just people too at the end of the day. And so when we ask, New Brunswickers, are we more or equally diverse as the rest of the country? And 48% said we were more or equally diverse. Well, media are New Brunswickers as well. So, we had to do an education there also. We've seen 3 regions develop or in the process of developing local strategies for immigration population growth. So we have a provincial strategy, but they're now owning and running with a local ownership of this issue, and really trying to be more competitive and more proactive about how they plan for this at a local level. We've seen a substantial increase in polling support for increased immigration levels, and I'll get to that in just a second. Many communities have created committees, kind of multi-sector committees to kind of work on planning, coordination, and address gaps for that newcomers experience. So again, it's kind of that local ownership has been activated. And we've seen several communities launch annual welcome events for newcomers to increase the visibility and kind of play a leadership role in publicly welcoming and publicly communicating why this is important for their community. And it served to set a much more positive tone at the community and grassroots level for welcoming newcomers. So this is basically at the end of the presentation, and I've got more I can share in terms of lessons learned in the discussion. But this is a poll, the same question we asked in 2017, in which 2/3 of our province believe that we should have the same numbers of immigrants or fewer. This is the same poll, the same questions asked 1 year later. And we were completely astonished at the change in the polling. You'll see here a 9% increase in those polled who believed we needed to have more immigrants to our province. We saw a drop in those that felt the same number was adequate, or perhaps we should have even fewer. So this was very encouraging for us. I mean, not something that we can necessarily take responsibility for, but our tour, the media engagement, the social media engagement, the conversations we created, I do believe had an impact on attitudes, and have created, I think, more public support and social license for increasing immigration to our province. Maybe just before I wrap, I'll say the province of New Brunswick just launched a new immigration strategy 2 weeks ago. And they have set a goal of increasing immigration to 7,500 people per year. And right now, today, we're at about 4,600 people coming per year. So they've increased immigration levels, and they've done that directly as a response to our New Conversations initiative. They cite that in the report. They're adopting our recommendations. So the tour served as a great kind of input into that public policy direction of our province. So with that, I'm going to thank folks for listening through that, and I'll pass it off to Jasmine.
Well, let me thank you first, Alex. That was extraordinary, and obviously the New Conversations in New Brunswick are having I would say, a catalytic effect, affecting community attitudes, creating the social license you mentioned. Bravo, congratulations. So now it's my pleasure. I'm going to pass this over now, and by introduce to Jasmine Gill. It's my pleasure to introduce Jasmine, who's Director Policy and Programs at the Century Initiative here in Toronto. Before joining Century Initiative to jumpstart its policy and programs agenda in 2017, Jasmine practiced intellectual property law in the publishing and media industries after graduating from University of Toronto's Faculty of Law and the Rotman School of Management. More recently, Jasmine has been the Executive Director of World Literacy Canada, an internationally focused NGO devoted to promoting human development and advancing opportunities for women and children through education. Welcome, Jasmine. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Ken. Can you hear me okay?
Beautiful.
Great. So let's jump right into it. Century Initiative is a national nonpartisan organization aimed at ensuring a prosperous future for Canada with the ambitious goal of increasing our population to 100 million by 2100. It is the inspiration of a group of prominent Canadians who came together with a vision for Canada in 2100, one that requires bold thinking, imagination, and creativity for a successful future for our country. To achieve this goal, we have to start thinking about our future now. We need a national discussion about growth, one that covers immigration, education, employment, infrastructure, and early childhood support. And Century Initiative is prepared to facilitate that. And that's the framework for today's conversation with you, Alex. And I would welcome the audience to download the slides, the Century Initiative slides, and join us in our efforts, learn more about our organization. We would welcome your thoughts and ideas. But let's start with you, Alex, my old friend. My first question for you, we both know that population growth is a critical factor for Canada's long-term success. And you've given us a great, very in-depth regional perspective. But I'd like you to tell us a bit more. You've given us a macro overview of the labor market shrinkage and the healthcare spending concerns faced by New Brunswick and the country at large. But what are the effects of these demographic trends on the everyday quality of life for New Brunswick residents? What do you see on the ground at a micro level day to day, and how might this compare with other regions in Canada?
Well, I can't necessarily speak to other regions as well as I can New Brunswick, but you know, at these conversations, we heard from many employers just that they're facing difficult decisions about whether to scale back their work or if they can relocate to other jurisdictions where the talent and skills they're looking for is more readily available. So that, I mean, that has a kind of a multiplier effect for our province and our economy when our local employers can't find people. There's it impacts local workers as well. But I think you know, the consequences of not addressing this are you know, we're already facing that in these small communities. We're facing an unprecedented healthcare labor shortage. There's something like 5,000 nurses required over the next 10 years in New Brunswick, and with an aging population, that kind of has a exacerbating impact. So we're going to need more nurses to take care of New Brunswickers. We don't have that workforce readily available. So I mean, the consequences span quality of life, the strength of the economy, and really the existence or the survival of some of these smaller communities.
That's right. And following New Conversations demographic and labor market presentations that you customized for each town that you visited, the attendees engaged in a dialogue about exactly those realities and challenges and opportunities in their respective towns and communities related to population growth. What did you learn from those conversations, from them specifically?
Well, maybe some of the observations and learnings I'll highlight that we ran into throughout the conversations. One is there's a persistent confusion between refugees and economic immigrants, and we're seeing that even now in our election in Canada, that there is these two kind of groups of immigrants are conflated, and people have a hard time understanding differences. Another observation is that mayors of local governments and chambers of commerce were largely passive supporters of immigration, but the tours served to kind of activate them and create more local ownership. Local communities didn't really see it as their role, or they didn't feel empowered to attract and retain people. I think historically there's a lot of push and pull between the different levels of government in terms of jurisdiction. So municipalities are very careful of taking on things that other levels of government should own. But immigration is not something that somebody else is going to do for you. They're not going to grow your community, and kind of it really needs to be owned locally. So that was another observation. The conversations focused on the head and the heart in a way, so we did share labor market and demographic information, but we also heard from employers and New Brunswickers, and that kind of, I think, served to reach people differently. Not everybody's going to get energized based on a presentation from an economist, so we had to kind of balance that out. And keeping politics out of it was an effective strategy. So we needed to try to protect against that.
In terms of the relative impact of the economic analysis versus the stories that were shared, was it hand in hand, both together created the change that you were looking for, or would you say that one was of more importance than the other in shifting opinions through the tour?
It's difficult to say. I think I think that people people need to hear the kind of the rationale and the logic and the kind of the objective information in order to buy into this. But in the end, this is a kind of a project involving people, and so we need that kind of personal engagement. You know, the current Minister of Immigration in Canada, Ahmed Hussein, has been talking a lot about we need to share the facts and we need to tell stories. And so our tour kind of was an example of that, in the sense that we shared the facts and we also gave them a local story, a local narrative to kind of bring those facts to life.
Right. And did those conversations, this is of particular interest to Century Initiative, did those conversations touch on areas outside of immigration, meaning that how does immigration interplay with the other province-building areas of infrastructure, employment, education, early childhood support? Were issues in those areas brought up over the course of these new conversations? And the second part of that question is, do you feel that there are the necessary supports in those areas in place to accommodate a larger population? What comes first and why? People or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we asked each community questions like, what would make your community an attractive place to a newcomer? What are the things that you might need if you came to a new community, and do those things exist right now? And so it was really asking in each of these events, asking them to identify really for themselves how this cuts across all of those themes you just mentioned. If we want kind of strong educational institutions, we need to have people engaged in those. We need to have a population to support it. For our colleges and universities, they're depending increasingly on international students because domestic enrollments are on decline. So in order for our kind of treasured post-secondary institutions in our province, and they are very much sources of pride for New Brunswick, those institutions are also facing an existential risk if they don't find ways of growing their student bodies and attracting international students. So it really does cut across all of those sectors you mentioned.
So what is the key then to unlocking the action that's necessary to accommodate growing immigration levels? We know that cities and towns are so central to this conversation, and new conversations really brought that to the fore. But what is an active role that a municipality can play in building the supports necessary to accommodate a growing population? Do you see a greater role for municipalities in setting policy? What, outside of educational institutions, or even including educational institutions, who are the actors within a community who can actively promote population growth and retention, and how?
Well, to your point about kind of why is it that we need to target municipalities and kind of how do we do that effectively, I think, like I mentioned earlier, at least in my observation, historically we've seen immigration as a federal responsibility. It's a system that's managed by our federal government. Even our provincial government has some role kind of at a state or province level would be the reference for folks, but it's not, they actually don't ultimately make decisions or policy about immigration. And so at a local level, you can feel quite disempowered on that and say, well, look, it's the responsibility of the federal government. We don't have any money to deal with this issue. And I think what we're trying to do in New Brunswick is facilitate a paradigm shift. If a municipality is, if you look at it as a business, and the revenues that help drive that business, the kind of the business plan, if you will, relies on tax revenues, from residents and from business in your community, and those numbers of taxpayers are on decline, your business is flawed. Your business plan is not addressing kind of how do you grow those revenues, how do you essentially maintain a viable business as a municipality so that you can provide good services and be competitive and attractive. And so, I think we're trying to help municipalities think differently about this. It's one thing to say, well, it's not our jurisdiction, we don't have any money for it, but if you don't have this business plan or this population plan, then what are we doing, right? I mean, then you're in a situation of managing the challenges of decline. So we're trying to spark that kind of ownership so that you may not have a lot of resources to invest in this, but if you don't take stock and own this, you can't expect somebody else to do it for you, and the consequences will be felt throughout your community.
Right, and I think this initiative, your initiative, New Conversations, was so instrumental in helping that paradigm shift that you mentioned. I had the good fortune of attending a few of those conversations. I saw the impact on the ground. But from your perspective, as objectively as possible, Alex, why do you think that this tour was so unique and so successful? Why exactly is this a new conversation? It seems pretty straightforward. Get the right people in the room, discuss challenges and obstacles and ways to overcome them. But it really was a very novel initiative from my standpoint, from the standpoint of many others. But from your point of view, why was this tour so unique?
I think it's a really valuable question, and I agree. It isn't overly complex to do this. I think that what made this successful, well, first of all, the reason why we did it is that just the polling data, the 48% of our province that believe we are more or equally diverse, the 2/3 of our province felt we should have the same numbers of newcomers or fewer. That's why we needed to tackle this. That there's a tension there in terms of the course we need to take as a province and people's readiness and comfort level with that. So you don't really have a choice. If we need to onboard people, we have to make sure that we get out there and communicate this so that the social license is there. And public attitudes very much drive public policy. So if the public attitudes continued to be resistant or uncomfortable, it would make raising immigration targets or making this a larger priority more challenging for our provincial government. So we wanted to create conditions for that political leadership and that policy direction through affecting public attitudes. In terms of what made it different, it was a genuine engagement with these communities. Every local community, we took the time to go and meet with them face-to-face, to have conversations with them multiple times in advance of the actual event, and they had roles in the conversation. So, it isn't novel in the sense of just having these community conversations, but doing it in a way that honors and respects that local autonomy, that local kind of personality and identity is something that takes a lot of time and energy. So I think that's an area we invested a lot of time, and I think it paid off.
Okay, so you mentioned public attitudes and the sheer amount of effort that went behind this initiative. What are the primary obstacles, or what would be the obstacles to rolling out a similar initiative across the country? And who do you think should lead this effort?
Well, I think the obstacle is just the logistics of making sure that you kind of, in a way, you engage those local gatekeepers, if you will. In New Brunswick, we in each of those communities, there were local influencers and institutions that you needed to have a coffee with to talk to them about this before you came in to their community. And so I think that's an important part, is kind of respecting that. And so logistically, I think at a national level, that's something that needs to be considered very carefully. And we had an ownership, we had support from the federal side and the provincial government side. So, at a national level, you would need to partner as well with the provinces and make sure that any conversations align with their current direction, their current kind of set of priorities around immigration because every province is kind of at a different stage. So, your tactics would need to adapt for that. But I think it's worthwhile, and I think that there's a lot of people are saying we need to affect this. We're all, I think, in this sector working in immigration and believing deeply that it enriches our communities, it makes us more vibrant, and it's ultimately good for our economy. We believe these things, but we see the threats of kind of political narratives and anti-immigrant attitudes kind of growing across the world, and so we have to be proactive, and we have to be engaged, and it's not a conversation that we're going to necessarily solve on a webinar, as an example. If we want to affect public attitudes, we have to get out and meet with the public, and I think that's what made the initiative different.
Yeah, and hopefully there will come a day where this conversation is not considered new, and despite the logistical challenges, it is a very, very worthwhile initiative from many different points of view. So, Kim, I think I can speak to Alex all day, and I often do, and I have a number of other questions, but I think we should take some audience questions.
So there's the list of audience questions
there.
Okay,
so I do see some coming up on the screen, and so I'll go ahead and randomly choose a couple of these great questions.
And we actually answered some of them already, I think. So you were kind of in line with the audience, I think, on that.
Yeah. I see one off the top, though. If you had to identify the biggest challenge in New Brunswick to the integration of newcomers, what would it be?
Okay, well, that's a good question. And then when I spoke with Kim prior to the call, we had some data at every tour stop to help a community understand kind of what percentage of their population was third generation Canadian or more or older, as an example. So just as an example, in the Acadian Peninsula, which is a francophone region in the northeast of our province, a lot of fishery and aquaculture activity in that area. 97% of the residents in the Acadian Peninsula are third generation Canadian or more. In other words, their parents were born in the area, their parents' parents were born in the area, and their parents' parents' parents. So they're third generation Canadian. That means that there hasn't been a lot of kind of immigration historically. The social fabric in those areas is very tight. It contributes to I'd say a high amount of social cohesion when you can go to the grocery store or the Tim Hortons or the various places in your community, and you know people, you recognize people, you're related to people. But for an immigrant coming into that context where there is such a tight social fabric and so much history between residents, and you're coming in without any of that, it can make the integration journey more difficult. So we have to, as a province, really kind of spark a paradigm shift in those areas to see that newcomers can kind of enrich our social fabric, and we need to open up our institutions, our activities to involve them more.
Go ahead, Kim.
No, that's just great. I noticed that we're running very close to the end of our hour, so I just want to make sure we get a couple more of these questions out. We've both had very rich discussion from both of you. Thank you very much. One of the questions that is coming up from Andy online are about some of the specific strategies that might be available to organizations like the New Brunswick Multicultural Council. He asks, what was the, this is it. He was asking earlier how you were working with employers to attract immigrants to the province. He also is interested in what kind, again, this issue of obstacles, what he says what was the main complaint from employers about getting foreign talent under the current system? Like what were the most pressing obstacles that your employers are facing?
Well, the employer engagement has jumped significantly in the last couple of years because of the Atlantic immigration pilots. Andy actually references that in his question as well. So how is the Atlantic pilot helping the province? Right now, we have over 700 employers currently designated to participate in the pilot, and somewhere around 400 actively kind of recruiting through that program. So employers are really coming to the table, and honestly, I don't think it's really a convincing exercise so much as a facilitation exercise. They are facing the labor challenges. They need support now to kind of go through the process, identify which markets to recruit from, how do they go through international recruitment. If they're smaller, how can they, like larger organizations can actually go travel internationally and screen candidates in other countries, but smaller organizations face challenges with that. So it's really adapting to the employer and facilitating them through the process, less kind of convincing them that they need to do this. And in terms of the challenges they're facing, I think it's, the process in that program is accelerated. It's much quicker. Some around 6 months, people can access permanent residency and be working in the province, which is very fast kind of in the immigration system, but it's still not fast enough for some employers if they're facing real-time needs. Mm-hmm. There are costs and investments that employers have to make. So, and then, the risk of people coming and then leaving or going to another business or moving to another part of the country is a fear for some employers. So just trying to make sure they have the right strategies in place so that people are welcomed, integrated, and properly settled, mm-hmm. so they have a chance for success.
Yeah. Now, Andy had another interesting question. Again, this is about thinking differently because international students aren't actually always considered a class of immigrants. So about that as a strategy for boosting local for immigration levels what maybe your thoughts on attracting international students. And that, I know that's something, Jasmine, that you're interested in too. So maybe, Jasmine, do you want to start, and then we'll go to...
Sure. From the standpoint of taking a holistic view of population growth and knowing that we're undertaking these efforts in light of an aging population and declining labor market, international students seem to be the obvious group to scale within Canada. They bring the talents, the skills, the initiative that we need to see our country forward. And so I think this is the subject of an entirely separate webinar myself, and I happily participate in it. But there are absolutely this subgroup of newcomers to Canada are vitally important.
How about how about you, Alex? How about this important group of individuals to your future in New Brunswick?
Well, we have many many post-secondary institutions in the province that are actively working on recruiting international students. That I guess just a couple quick comments. We need to. An attachment to the labor market is really important for international students. So initiatives that favor that. The attraction and bringing international students to study in our province is one part, but another part is making sure they connect to the workforce during their studies and maybe part-time capacities or summer jobs. So initiatives that help that happen, and then ultimately that help them find meaningful employment after their graduation will ultimately be, necessary for retention of international students. One thing I will mention, though, is that on the international student file, we're running into housing challenges. Actually, housing across the board is probably one of the bigger challenges that we're going to face structurally in terms of population growth, is just making sure we have adequate and affordable housing options for international students and newcomer families in all of these communities. And so we're seeing a lot of kind of activity on the housing file, and I expect it will only increase in the months and years ahead.
And I'd just like to throw in, part of our work is bringing together experts from across the country to analyze and come up with recommendations and solutions on a broad number of issues. We have a report coming out called Scaling International Education this fall, where we brought together experts working in this field to think about Canada's long-term potential for drawing in and retaining international students. So I would invite everyone to have a look, and perhaps that can be the subject of another conversation, albeit not a new conversation.
I certainly hope so. Well, I have one more question before we wind up. This one is from Augustina Ocaseri, who has a lot of questions, but I'm going to focus just on the first one very briefly. What can municipalities do to work with federal and provincial governments to increase the number of immigrants to their communities? I think we all agree that the role of the local is critical in ensuring the success of the immigrant. But how can cities advocate for the kind of policy change or funding that they need from higher levels of government? Have you got any advice for us, Alex and Jasmine?
Jasmine, did you want to go, or do you want me to go?
I can start. I can think of a couple of things off the top of my head. One is to get the word out.
The role of the local is critical in ensuring the success of the immigrant. But how can cities advocate for the kind of policy change or funding that they need from higher levels of government? Have you got any advice for us, Alex and Jasmine?
Jasmine, did you want to go, or do you want me to go?
I can start. I can think of a couple of things off the top of my head. One is to get the word out about many of these smaller and mid-sized communities. So often Canada is equated with its larger urban centers, and there's certainly more to be done in the realm of advertising and sharing the attractiveness of the communities across Canada, and then secondly, creating the conditions to really enable successful population growth in our towns. So ensuring that there are the right connections and collaborations between educational institutions, employers, settlement services groups, just to make sure that everyone is working in an aligned fashion to enable and to draw talent to their community, because that's really what people represent.
Thank you. And how about you, Alex?
Well, I think there's a lot to that. That could also be a separate. Well, I guess this is the theme of the series. But I think municipalities don't, I guess, at present have a kind of maybe a formal role in kind of selecting or processing applications or things like that. But I think the best way for municipalities, my personal view, is the best way for municipalities to be taken seriously and to play a credible role in that dialogue is to develop a local plan. And this was one of our key recommendations to the municipalities after our tour, in our tour report, is that as a community, if you want to be taken seriously, if you want to make progress on this, you need to develop a plan, and you need to have a person responsible for this. And I think those are just two very basic ingredients. And municipalities would often say, well, we don't have resources for a position or for a new person. It doesn't have to be a new person. If you have somebody responsible for community development, make it a part of their role, or maybe somebody doing economic development, make it part of their role, but make it distinct, make it a formal piece of their responsibility is around population growth, and then go about creating a plan with your local community and stakeholders so that you can show the provincial government or the federal government that, look, you're taking this seriously, you've invested resources and time, you have a playbook, and then they're kind of more supporting your leadership rather than kind of being asked to take the leadership role for you. So I think that really kind of owning it and leading, my experience, and I've seen this from the federal and provincial governments, is when they see leadership at a local level, they tend to be there to support. And so I think that the challenge is actually on kind of really owning it at a local level.
Well, that's great. We've both of you. That's a wonderful session. We're now at the end of our Q&A. Before I go, I'd like to close by asking both of you one short, what I call a short fire question. I'm looking for a very short word or a short phrase. If you had to leave us today with one short, important message to share with people about that immigrant imperative we've been discussing today, what would it be? Alex?
Wow, you didn't prepare me for this question. I think it's an opportunity, but it's not an inevitable success. So this is not. We have to work at this. It's not going to happen. You can't automatically bring people or believe that this will all be successful on its own. We have to work at this. We have to continuously engage. Maybe it's that, continuously engage, because success is not guaranteed.
That's great. An opportunity worth really focusing on. And how about you, Jasmine? What would your message be?
I would say that Canada is already leading the way in the world in terms of the immigrant imperative. Our capacity to attract, integrate, and retain immigrants is relatively strong. But for us, it's a question of to what scale do we want to demonstrate this latent strength and potential that Canada has. And we feel quite strongly that growing our population ambitiously and over the long term is the surest way to build long-term prosperity in this country. And it's important that we start now.
That's great. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you both. Thank you. Our time has run out. Thank you for joining us today to explore this rich set of ideas on Canada's immigrant future. The first in the new webinar series on building a welcoming economy for Canada's smaller towns, cities and regions. Please stay tuned for our exciting fall program. To our audiences, thank you. We will be sending you a rich set of resources and links to the archive video today and the related resources, including the new report we're looking forward to from the Century Initiative. We'll be following Alex's progress with great interest in the months to come. On behalf of Cities of Migration and all our participants, let me thank our distinguished presenters, Alex Leblanc of the New Brunswick Multicultural Council and Jasmine Gill, Century Initiative, for a brilliant exchange of ideas. Thank you also to Claire Ellis for impeccable technical and production support here at Cities of Migration's Learning Exchange. To our audiences in Cities of Migration everywhere, imagine this excellent work being interpreted in your city, adapted by your organization, or changing your neighborhood. We'd like to hear your stories and share more good practice, so please stay connected.